basically right. You know, they named it after St. Augustine. Feast day, when they decided land.
Yeah, I mean these are not original kinds of people. This is they go with these standard practices, which is kind of helpful. And so if you see that, you now can tell me what day of the year St. Augustine died, because remember, feast days are almost always when they die. Which kind of makes sense.
That's weird, though. Yay, he died!
Well, so let's think about it in an early church sense, right? So there is, and we didn't really talk about this through the process, but especially early, right? So in like the Apostolic Fathers, the Apologists, pre-Constantinople, or not Constantinople, pre-Nicaea, kind of, there is a Council of Constantinople, and so it is before that, but that's not what I'm going for here. This became very common. And actually what the church started doing is they would remember regularly not only these big names, but people in their individual lives. They would remember the day of their death, but they would remember it as basically their birthday into heaven. Yeah, so it does seem kind of strange to us, but the way they're seeing it is it's far more significant the day they died, because that's the day they entered into paradise, right? Or crowned with Christ and are with him and all of that kind of stuff. And especially how often this associates with martyrdom in the early church. That association gets made. This paired with the fact that for most of these guys, we don't know when they were born anyway, but it gives us that opportunity to remember. It's a confession of the resurrection. Really is what it is, and eternal life. Did we talk at all? I can't remember what I say things all over the place, right? Did we talk at all about why there are so many saints' days that are celebrated?
To break up the wars?
Yeah, okay, we did a little bit then. So the Catholic Church in Europe, shortly after the fall of Rome, is dealing with a lot of wars with Christian groups. And they're trying to put a stop to that, and so they have the Truce of God. Truce of God is you can't harm non-combatants. The Peace of God is that you can't fight on holy days, which are Sundays and festival days of saints, right? And so if you fill up the whole calendar with saints' days, then I don't know, they have to feel bad about fighting, because they didn't generally listen to that, right? There's only so much influence that kind of thing was going to have, but it was an attempt.
There was a controversy about that this year.
Oh, was there?
In which they moved the commemoration of the Saints' Day off of the traditional day, and the question was, is it still a holy day of obligation?
Yeah.
And the Vatican had to deal with that this year.
Interesting. Do you know where they came down on?
They said it's not.
Yeah.
If they moved it, you're not obligated.
On that, you got to do it on the other day. Interesting. Yeah. Aren't you thankful we don't have holy days of obligation, so that we don't have to worry about those kinds of things? But good. So we're moving through. We got one more class after today, and so we're hitting who is arguably the most famous of all the church fathers, certainly in the West. In the East, there are other guys that probably have more fame, because they're Eastern theologians, and Augustine is a Western theologian. But Augustine is, right, if you're going to have recognized any of these names, this is probably the one. He is a huge figure in the early church. We really cannot do him justice in this class, so we're going to do a lot of really overview stuff. Honestly, what we've been doing this whole time. I think in that collection that I've mentioned a couple of times of the works of the church fathers, like the collected edition that's like 40-something volumes, at least 10 of those volumes are just Augustine, if not more. And I think a huge chunk of the other ones are Jerome or something like that, yeah. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about that, but he is extremely, we have a lot of his stuff, and it all continues to this day, right? When we talked about Origen might have written more than Augustine, but we lost a lot of it, right? And so, well, you can only read things that you still have. We still have a lot of what Augustine wrote. So he is this major figure, especially as we move towards the end of the patristic age, which we're not there yet, but we're kind of moving that direction, if you will, certainly as far as the class is concerned. So in addition to just talking about Augustine, this is a place to kind of note that while we only picked one of them, there are a number of these kind of doctors of the church in the Western Christianity around this time, very significant figures. Two of them are in today's lesson. Augustine is one, obviously, a figure that Augustine interacted with quite a bit. Ambrose of Milan is another one. And then one that we won't be talking about, who I believe predates these two, if I'm correct, is Jerome. If you remember the word, the Vulgate, right? That Latin edition of the Bible that was the only Bible in the Western Church, basically, until Luther. That was Jerome who put that together. And of course, we've already spoken about him, although he's in a kind of a different category. Tertullian of Carthage, right? That guy that coined the term Trinity. So while, yes, a lot of theological gravity was in the Eastern Church in the early centuries of Christianity, let's recognize that the West is not just this backwater of society and theological thought. There's a lot going on there. But I guess part of the reason why the West doesn't have this same vibrance in patristics is partly because most of the heretics were coming from the East as well. And as we've noticed a lot in this, the really significant church fathers are the ones that deal with the significant heresies. So if you don't have as many heresies coming out of the Western half of the Christian Empire, or the Christian world in this sense, Roman Empire, you don't have as many opportunities, if you will, for these men to kind of make great names. Go ahead.
So can you attribute that to anything? Why the West would have fewer heresies?
I personally can't. But if I were to venture guesses, the western half of the Roman Empire was far more homogenous than the eastern half. I mean, the various areas that we're talking about here, so North Africa, Spain, Gaul, France, right nowadays, these are areas that have been conquered a long time ago and have been deeply incorporated into the empire. And the eastern half, it's been conquered for a really long time, but you have far more people groups and ethnic groups, and you have a lot more diversity. So maybe that contributes to part of it. Also, the center of philosophical thought for the entire Mediterranean begins right in Greece and these areas and Alexandria. And so there's just more academia going on over here by definition. And, it's where Christianity starts. And so there's more significance there. Those would be my guesses. Joe, do you have any insights?
I think you're accurate, especially since in the Western Empire, the big issue was converting the pagans.
Right.
Rather than dealing with heresies.
Yeah, and this is not to say that there weren't heretics in the Western, right? A lot of the heretics were, we talked about the Gnostics really early on. The Gnostics were in Gaul, but they kind of got dealt with pretty early on. We're going to talk about a heresy group that's big in the West today, the Manichaeans. So it's not as if there aren't heretics running around in the West. They're just not of the same quality and quantity as in the East, right? Good. Any other questions before we dive into Augustine? By the way, just because Steve has referenced it that way, I don't care if you say Augustine or Augustine. I say Augustine because that's the one I grew up saying. I don't know which one's technically correct, right? It's translation from another language anyway, so call it whatever you would like. But yeah, like I said, those are both, as far as I'm concerned, acceptable traditions.
Catholic way.
It does seem that the Catholic Church goes with Augustine a little bit more, but like I said, at least to me, doesn't matter. You can call them. Yeah, this is not the same thing as Chrysostom and Christosum. Like, that irritates me, but the Augustine-Augustine one, we're good there, right? So let's dive into the life of Augustine, and it is it's kind of wild. He has a very interesting and, let's say, colorful life in many ways that we haven't seen in a lot of the other church fathers. I mean, Cyril had some dramatic stuff going on, but him as a person wasn't quite that. We'll just say colorful, not like Augustine. And if you don't already know what I'm talking about, then you will by the time we're done here. A first for this class, as far as I can remember, Augustine was born on November the 13th of 354. We know the day he was born. I didn't notice any explanation of why we know the exact day. I have some guesses. He's born into an aristocratic family. So this is not one of those, we knew he would be important, so we marked his birth. But he was in a wealthy aristocratic family in an important part of the Roman Empire. So chances are there were better records being kept, that kind of thing. But we know he was born November 13th of 354. So timeline-wise, we're right around the same time as Cyril. We're kind of, we're post-Nicaea. Things are still getting sorted out, that kind of thing. He was born in the Roman province of Hippo Regius, which is not actually why he's known as Augustine of Hippo, but it's convenient that he is born in the same city that he will eventually become bishop of, because again, that's how you get that of title. So he will become bishop much later in his life, obviously. So he's born in the Roman province of Hippo Regius, which is in modern-day Algeria, so North Africa. And he regularly identifies himself as an African. He also identifies himself as a Roman, which I think in our modern minds, it's not that common for us to say, a Roman African, that must have been strange. It really wasn't. Northern Africa was an immensely important area for the Roman Empire. He is not far from Carthage, which, if you remember your good Roman Republic history, the Punic Wars and Hannibal, that's where they were, the original rival of Rome, which is now very Roman, right? The Romans won that war, all three of them, and right, so Tertullian, also a Roman, or at least living in a Roman, although his ancestry is a little bit questioned. Our best guess, going off of things that Augustine said, is that yes, he was a Roman citizen. He was born into a Roman aristocratic family, but they were not ethnically Latin. Our best guess is that they were Berbers, which is just a North African ethnic group from around this time. I think Berbers still exist as an ethnicity, but you can correct me. They come out of the ancient land, if you will, of Numidia, which is going to be referenced again, which is just another chunk of northern Africa. The Numidians and the Egyptians fought each other a lot, but that's way back in history. It's all Rome now, different provinces. So while he is not Latin in origin, he is a full-fledged Roman citizen. He is a Roman and he is an African. Based on surnames and other things, we suspect that his family had likely been an aristocratic member of Roman society for at least 100 years. His family name is Aurelius, which has roots, and so it's not 100%, but it is a good chance, right? You might have heard of that surname or that family name Aurelius, right? Marcus Aurelius is probably the most famous. Now, there's only like 7 Roman family names, so the connection's not quite that close, but he is of a significant Roman family. So while not ethnically Roman, he is, for all intents and purposes, a Roman. He was born to a Christian mother who is known to history as Saint Monica. By the way, Monica is a Berber name. That's why we're pretty sure he's of Berber descent. And his father, however, was pagan. We know his name. I didn't write it down. We know the names of his whole family, maybe not his sister. But he had a Christian mother, Saint Monica, and a pagan father. He also had a brother and a sister. So it was 3 kids. His father was a pagan, although his father did convert on his deathbed to Christianity. So we can take for that what we will. But in many ways, Augustine grew up in that kind of split household sort of situation. Although this does kind of reinforce some of the things we've talked about over the past couple of weeks of kind of one of the roles that a lot of women took in the early church, which was converting husbands and families and that sort of thing, right? You got a question for me, Bill? Oh, you looked like you did. Okay. So, split, although his father does convert on his deathbed. 1 brother, 1 sister. At the age of 11, he was sent out of Hippo to a small Numidian city for schooling. This is where he began his formal classical education. It's also where we get the first and one of the more famous stories about his life. While he was there, so as a young child, a whole bunch of other schoolboys, there's a story of him stealing fruit off of a pear tree. So he and the other boys jumped the fence, grabbed a bunch of fruit, and ran away with it. We know this because Augustine writes about it. That's how we know basically everything about Augustine. It's getting ahead of the curve here. He wrote an autobiography. So we know a lot about him. And in this autobiography, he examines sin. He does other things too, but it's called Confessions. So he is looking, and he does a lot of work examining sin, guilt, where it comes from, why people sin, why he was sinning, that sort of thing. And he agonizes over this story quite a bit in Confessions. He writes on it at length, trying to figure out why he did it. As he said, I wasn't hungry. None of us were hungry. Right? They were at a school. They were aristocrats. They were not hungry. He even says it wasn't even that the fruit was good. I had better food back in the dorm, if you will. He comes to the conclusion, and it's an interesting thought about sin, but that he participated in this theft and took joy in this theft because of the camaraderie it gave him with his friends, right? He was just bonding with his friends, right? Now, he recognizes that it's not okay later in his life, but this is kind of one of these self-examination, right? Where does sin come from? And he makes this interesting point here that oftentimes sin comes not from a desire to sin, but from desiring an inferior good, right? So he wanted something good, which is camaraderie with his friends, and he did it in a bad way. And so he kind of pushes that direction a lot with some of his examination of sinfulness. This is not the last time that we will see Augustine sinning. This is just the first and one of those famous examples of it. Questions about stealing from the pear tree? All right. At the age of 17, Augustine found a patron, and the patron supported him to go study in Carthage. This is an opportunity for a tangent and an aside. How many of you are familiar with the patron-client system in Rome? All right, this is great. Lots of fun. So you had overall, you had a 2-part system. You had the patron and you had the clients. Patron is where we get the word patronage from. You're probably very familiar with. The patrons would pay for things for other people. In this case, it was whoever this was paid for Augustine to go to attend school. In Rome, it was very common that your patron would give you food. So basically the patrons would often set up like food banks in their house, and specific families were invited to come and eat the food. They were considered the clients. Now, why would the patrons do this? Was it out of the kindness of their heart? No, not even close. So in the case of a lot of these patron families in Rome, they did it to buy votes, right? I will give you bread. When an election comes up, you vote the way I tell you to vote, right? In the case of Augustine, this was likely more of a, I will pay for you to go to school. And when you're a brilliant author, teacher, you will make me famous because of it, right? A really famous example of this, although it's famous in philosophy circles, there's a Stoic philosopher. His name is Epictetus. He was a little bit different in the system. He was considered a slave because he was a client that became a client when he got captured in a war. But all the philosophy that he ended up writing, or he was treated very well, given an education, he was talented, so he would write philosophy. His benefactor, the patron, would get the credit for it, right? I mean, his name is still attached to it, but it'd be kind of like, oh, Jeff, I read your client's new tome on philosophy. It's fantastic. And then you now gain clout in your social circles, that kind of thing. Most artists, musicians, and philosophers in Rome fell into that client system. And it led to enormously corrupt elections as well. Right, like ridiculous levels of corruption. So anyway, at the age of 17, Augustine enters into one of these patron-client relationships, which doesn't really come back up in our story. It's just an excuse for me to tell you about the culture of ancient Rome. And his way is paid to go to school in Carthage. He was an aristocrat. They had money. They didn't have that much money, is kind of the sense. But he found someone who saw promise in him and agreed to pay. His mother was not thrilled about this. And a bit of an anachronism, but more or less she kept warning Augustine about the dangers of the big city, right? Because that's what Carthage was. It was a huge metropolis, big deal, right? One of these major Mediterranean cities. And she was nervous about her son getting up to all sorts of nonsense while he was there. Well-founded fears, because shortly after arriving in Carthage, Augustine adopted a hedonist lifestyle. It was basically, there are no pleasures that I will not participate in. I'm going to do what I want, when I want, how I want, and with who I want, which is one of the things that he did. Shortly after, while he was still 17, so within the first year of arriving in Carthage, he began a long-term affair with a commoner, a common Carthaginian woman, to which his mother disapproved even more. He's an aristocrat. You don't get involved with commoners, and you most certainly don't have an affair with them. So his mother was very much against this, warned him against the dangers of fornication, and Augustine did not listen to her at all, and had a child with this woman. I don't think he was in a relationship with this individual for 15 years. I don't know when in this process he had a child with her, but he does. It is known, I didn't write it down, but Augustine enters into a hedonistic lifestyle, the dangers of the big city, if you will. He does, like I said, he does enter into a 15-year affair with a commoner. He is not married ever to this woman, because she's a commoner. You don't marry commoners, which distressed him. This wasn't something that he liked, which we'll find out about later. Also, while he's in, Constantinople, while he's in Carthage, he's also introduced to Manichaean philosophy. Have we talked about Manichaeism here in a way that any of you remember? I think it got like an honorable mention in our heretics class like 3 years ago.
Yeah.
These are not the Pneumatologians, right? Even though it kind of has similar sounds. The Manichaeans, in short, are, you might say, they're deistic dualists. So the Manichaeans have this general overriding belief that there are, and this is simplifying the whole thing, right? There are two deities, a good deity and an evil deity, and they are equal to one another, opposed to one another, and are equally influential over the world. This is far more the philosophy of Star Wars than, I mean, I know people try and pull some Christian, and you can get little bits here and there, but the general idea in Star Wars, right, is you have to balance the light and the dark side of the Force. That's Manichaean, right? George Lucas was inspired by more Asian philosophies that pick up this idea separate from Manichaeism. You've probably seen the yin-yang. It represents the same thing, balance in all sorts of things, including balance of good and evil. Like I said, it developed parallel to Manichaeism. This is, quite frankly, this idea that there are two gods, one good, one evil, they're fighting it out and neither can gain the upper hand on one another, is a pretty natural human thought when you take a look at the world, right? It seems like, sometimes the evil starts winning and then, the good comes back and takes it, right? And then the good starts winning, but, then the evil comes, right? It's a fairly natural human thought if you're just observing the world. So he was introduced to Manichaean philosophy and he took to it. He officially becomes a Manichaean, although he stays at the initiate level. So this is, you can almost think of this like, those secret orders that exist, right? You start as an initiate, then you get the next tier when you kind of advance and you keep working your way up this ladder. Augustine never progresses past the level of initiate. But he does become a Manichaean while he is in Carthage. Questions on that before we go back to his career rather than what he's getting up to in Carthage, which is mostly a whole bunch of stuff that saints aren't supposed to be doing, right? He's not sleeping around, but he is sleeping with one person he's not supposed to be. He's going full whole hog hedonist, and he's involved himself with a heretical sect. 2 years later, in the year 373, at the age of 19, we get to see that whoever Augustine's patron was knew what he was talking about. Augustine had already begun teaching at the age of 19. In Carthage, he would teach rhetoric and grammar. So he was only there 2 years before they had him stop being a student and start being a teacher. And his career only skyrockets from there. His academic career, if you will. And I think that's a good way to think about Augustine at this point. He is an academic. He is embarking on this career of teaching, particularly in rhetoric, which is probably worth discussing and making sure we all know what that is. Do you all know what rhetoric is?
Reasoning or argument presentation?
Yeah, we tend to get into the reasoning and argument side of things. In the ancient world, rhetoric's a little bit more broad, but it is basically like that, right? You may have heard of like rhetorical questions or rhetorical arguments, right? Rhetoric is the art of speaking, like public speaking. It involves a lot of arguing. It was considered kind of the pinnacle of academic ability and discipline. Right? You started with grammar, then you did philosophy, and then you did rhetoric. And so being a teacher at 19 in a major city is significant enough, but the fact that he's already teaching rhetoric is an extra layer of being impressive, right? With this in mind, Augustine becomes a rhetorician. He is a philosopher as well. He gets more of this after he leaves Carthage, which we'll talk about in a minute, but Augustine is deeply involved in Greek, specifically Neoplatonic philosophy. That's what he's spending a lot of his time thinking about at this point in his life. So he teaches in Carthage for 10 years, and in 383, at the age of 29, he moves on up in the world, if you will. He moves to Rome to continue his teaching career, right? When he is in Rome, that's where he gets very deep into the Neoplatonic Greek philosophers and that kind of thing. It's also while he's in Rome that he becomes pretty disillusioned with Manichaeism. Mostly because of the influence of philosophy, he starts seeing holes in Manichaeism. He starts seeing places where it just isn't satisfying to him. So he is more or less fading out of Manichaeism even when he goes to Rome. He's only in Rome for a year. Apparently he didn't like it there. Part of it is because he gets a better posting, but he does mention how he did not like it. Apparently the tradition was for students to pay on the last day of classes, basically. And it was shocking how often students would get sick on the last day of class, and then they'd go through all their studies and everything, and they just wouldn't show up again. And so Augustine was not a fan of teaching in Rome. And so in the next year, he more or less, kind of to use some modern terms, he gets hired to teach at the top university in the empire. He goes to teach in Milan, to be the rhetoric teacher in Milan, which is the equivalent of the highest position in his field, right? There's no more room to go up after that. That's as good as it gets. And he gets there by 31, which is very impressive. Augustine was an immensely intelligent and talented individual to be able to kind of move up the academic ranks that quickly. Any other questions before we keep going? All right. So as I said, Augustine for 10 years is a Manichaean initiate. He never moves forward he never moves beyond that initiate level. And by the time he's in Rome, he's pretty disillusioned with Manichaeism. There is another force going on at and around this time that is definitely part of his move away from Manichaeism. So I said, 383, he moves to Rome. 3 years earlier, in the year 380, Emperor Theodosius I issues what is known as the Edict of Thessalonica. We've talked about Constantine's Edict of Milan. Does anyone remember what that one did? The Edict of Milan made Christianity legal in the Roman Empire. Any guesses as to what the Edict of Thessalonica does?
Makes it illegal?
No, it doesn't make it illegal. The opposite of that. It makes it the state religion. In fact, so Milan is kind of a religious tolerance. Thessalonica is you are Christians. So in the year 380, with the Edict of Thessalonica, Theodosius I proclaims that Christianity is the only legitimate religion in the empire. Does that mean that all the other religions go away? No.
And that's the Roman Empire?
The Roman Empire, right? And we're still combined-ish at this point-ish, kind of. The Western Roman Empire is not going to be looking good by the end of this class. But they're still around. They're still a thing. We're still on a united empire with Theodosius I. But Christianity is the only officially recognized religion, which means you can't officially be anything else as a Roman citizen. But, of course, they still were, in the similar way that Christians were Christians before they were allowed to be Christians, right? There were some persecutions of non-Christian faiths. One of them was that Theodosius I ordered the rounding up of Manichaean monks, which Augustine was not, right? He didn't get high enough to be on the chopping block. But I'm pretty confident that the fact that Rome had pretty significantly turned away from anything but Christianity had to have had some influence on Augustine's movement. By the way, just because it's relevant here, why is Milan, not Rome, the highest posting for someone, right? That seems strange, doesn't it? Shouldn't Rome be the highest posting of the academia in the Roman Empire. So why is it Milan? Do any of you have any idea? It's one of these weird things of history.
Have anything, is it a big sequel?
I'm pretty sure it is, but no, that's not why. The capital of Rome at this point had unofficially been moved to Milan. So Rome is still the official capital because it's Rome. It's the eternal city. That's going to come back up, right? The Roman calendar is still dated to the founding of Rome. But Milan was a more politically expedient and secure place to be. Roman emperors had been not being in Rome for longer and longer and longer, partly because there's a lot of political drama going on in Rome. And if you're Roman, political drama doesn't mean someone's going to say something nasty about you on the news or send out a tweet about you. Roman political drama often ends with poison or daggers or people dying. So the Roman emperors were trying to move their power outside of Rome. The army was becoming more significant. The Senate was becoming less significant. And that was an active role. So Milan was kind of the unofficial capital of Rome at this time. And so Milan was, Milan and Constantinople, right? Because we do have split capitals at this point because the Roman Empire was too big to just have one. You needed two seats of governing in the ancient world to be able to cover that much territory. For what it's worth, I know we're not talking about Ambrose, but Ambrose is the bishop in Milan when Augustine moves there, if you will. And you can't pass up this whole section without talking a little bit about the one of the big things that Ambrose did. I believe it was Theodosius I too, although I might not be correct about that. But while one of these emperors, I think it was Theodosius, is ruling, there's a revolt in Greece. I'm now convinced it was Thessalonica, but it's also the Edict of Thessalonica, so there might not be, and that's just stuck in my head. Anyway, there was a revolt in Greece that Theodosius went to go put down. When he put it down, he went overboard and basically massacred a whole city and the surrounding countryside. Just abject, no questions, everyone died. That's what he did to put down the rebellion. And these are Romans, by the way. They're not like some other territory. This section, Greece has been part of the Roman Empire since before Caesar, Julius Caesar. I mean, this is like as Roman as you get outside of Italy. And he went and just wiped down a whole city, burnt it to the ground, killed everyone he could find. This caused a scandal, and news got to Ambrose, who, when the emperor got back to Milan to go be emperor again, Ambrose locked the doors. He locked the city gates and said, no, you're not allowed to come back in. I'm excommunicating you for what you did. Which is a huge deal in like the long-term trajectory of the relationship between the church and the Roman Empire, right? Or Western European countries that will come up later, kingdoms, because you have basically a bishop and the emperor having a power struggle with one another, and Ambrose wins. Theodosius is not allowed back into the city. He is told in like the middle of January at the foot of the Alps, more or less, to walk barefoot around the city 7 times, and then walk up the steps to the Cathedral of Milan on his knees before Ambrose prostrated himself on the ground in penance, to which Ambrose welcomed him back into the church. Let's not forget, this is the Roman emperor who is doing this, with a bishop standing and making him do it. Going forward, I mean, this is a huge hit to imperial power and a huge boost to ecclesial power in Europe. Basically, from this point forward, the church is, like the ecclesial nature of the church is at least on par with every other political ruler until basically Martin Luther. And then it only starts to change. Right? Who crowns the kings in all of Europe throughout all of the Middle Ages? Pope. Now, other things happen that to solidify that, but this is one of these places we can kind of trace back to with Ambrose of Milan. So, major city, significant individual in the church. If I had one extra week, we'd do one on Ambrose of Milan. He'd be my first addition into it. Because he's that's a really good story. How he got elected bishop is also fascinating, but I gotta leave something to the imagination. So you can ask me some other time if you want to know the story of him becoming bishop. Where am I? So by the time Augustine does move to Milan, I think they didn't have a term for this, but I think we would classify him as an agnostic. He believes in higher powers and deities, but he doesn't really have any firm beliefs or thoughts about them, and in large part, he doesn't really care that much either. So again, that's not a term they had, but that's kind of the feeling that you get, that when he goes to Milan, he's mostly an agnostic. He's just kind of floating around there, content to just do his career thing and be fine with it. He does move to Milan with his mother and his son. They both accompany him to Milan.
What about the commoner?
It's a little unclear, at least in the stuff I read. Do you happen to know if she came with him?
Is this Bernice?
It's the first one. By the way, that's right. You don't call it World War I because there was only one of them. So I don't know which one it is. So, like I said, I'm not entirely sure, because while he's in Milan, this is going a little bit out of order, but that's totally fine. While he's in Milan, his mother arranges a marriage for him to a good, aristocratic 11-year-old Roman girl. Now, they recognize Ambrose cannot marry an 11-year-old, so it's an arranged marriage, but Augustine cannot marry an 11-year-old. So it's an arranged marriage. He has to dismiss. So yeah, he dismisses his concubine at this point. So she must have gone with him to some extent. But he can't marry her. He has to wait until she comes of age. Then they can marry, right? Augustine's not a fan of this. He doesn't really want to marry her anyway. And after dismissing his first concubine, while waiting for his betrothed wife, I suppose, to come of age, he starts up another affair with another concubine. It is just what we call them. They're not like, wasn't their career or anything. But it's also at this time that Augustine apparently he's become a Christian during this process, right? But apparently he starts praying what is just one of these great prayers that he recognizes is not good. It's a little bit longer, but I cut out a few adjectives here and there. But it is basically, Augustine starts praying. Here we go. Grant me chastity, but not yet. And how many times have we wanted to pray? Maybe it's not chastity, right? But how many times have we wanted a prayer like that? He recognizes that this was an insincere prayer and not a good thing when he describes it to us. But apparently that was his prayer during this time while he was betrothed to an 11-year-old while having an affair with someone else. God, grant me chastity later. But shortly after he moves to Milan, he strikes up a friendship with Ambrose. There's a famous, potentially apocryphal story, we don't know, of him meeting Ambrose. He was in the library, and Ambrose was there reading silently to himself, and it impressed Augustine so much that he decided to get to know this individual. Which might sound like a really low bar, being able to read silently, but we need to kind of keep in mind some contextual details here. Manuscripts at this point, like books, let's just say, were not written the same way they are now. We waste so much. We're extremely wasteful with how we write and type and print. because paper's cheap for us. It wasn't for them. So what they did is, oh, and by the way, they haven't invented punctuation yet. Not really. They haven't invented a distinction between capitals and lowercase. So they're using one or the other, right? So it's all caps lock or all lowercase. Oh, that's the other thing. They don't put spaces between any of their words because spaces cost money, right? And so it is, and you can look these up, just look up some old Bible manuscripts. They are solid blocks of letters. So type up something, get something typed up in Word, some news article, right? Hit Control F, find all of the spaces and hit backspace, and then try and read it without, read it silently. You can probably do it, but again, remember, you also have to get rid of all the punctuation, and you have to put it all in capitals, right? And then potentially you need to put it in a different language than your original, right? Depending on what you're doing. So, more impressive than we might think that Ambrose didn't need to. So what most people would do, I skipped this part, is they would sound it out as they went. And as you say it, you can hear the words. And you go, okay, this is where that word starts, this is where that word ends. By the way, just as a little side note to the side note here, there's like 2 places in the New Testament that we're not actually sure what the 2 words are. Because most of the time, the word, you can tell the separation between the 2 words because it's obvious, right? Even if it could split in more than one spot, you know which word is meant, right? It's like, there's not an elephant at Jesus' baptism or something. It's like, we can rule that one out. It's, John the Baptist, something like that, right? But there's like 2 places where both of them make sense. And so we don't actually know which one it is. But they're, like most manuscripts, confusions, if you will. They're very minor and they're fairly insignificant. And we got a pretty good guess as to which one it is, but we really don't know. Which was really annoying because they would give us that one to translate. And like 3 weeks beforehand, they would always remind us to look at the critical apparatus. And then we didn't, because who looks at the critical apparatus? These are the nightmare of notes at the bottom. If you want to see it, it's crazy. None of it's in English. Not all of it's in Greek either, right? There's Latin, there's Syriac, there's Hebrew. It's a nightmare. But then they'll say, oh, well, did you do the other translation that was possible there? And I went, no. And then we got in trouble. Anyway, I'm sure you have some similar experiences with these kinds of things. Yeah, Greek professors are mean. The Hebrew guys aren't as mean about this kind of stuff. But anyway, so he strikes up a friendship with Ambrose because he's extremely impressed by him. Augustine, one of the brightest minds of his time. Ambrose is also one of the brightest minds of his time. So the 2 of them struck up a friendship. Ambrose is older than Augustine. And in fact, at some point before Augustine had come to Milan, his father passed away. And Ambrose kind of takes Augustine under his wing as like a second father. Augustine will later call him his spiritual father. Because it is the work primarily of Ambrose, but also, and parents, this is good for you to know too, his mother was working on him this whole time. So even if your children are hedonist heretics, keep working on them because they may just be the greatest theologian of our era, right? I'm all over the place in my notes. So a few things happened that actually kind of sparked Augustine's conversion. So Ambrose is working on him. His mother is still working on him. We know, because he wrote about it, that in August of 386, so while Augustine was still 31, his friends at the university, they didn't call it a university, anachronism, it's okay, you guys know what I'm talking about. So the other people at the place he's teaching start reading the life of Antony, which, if you'll remember, is the biography of that monk out in the desert that Athanasius wrote. So they start reading that, and so Augustine starts getting interested in this kind of thing and the thoughts that are coming out of this. And then there's a story where, and in the readings I had, I don't know if it was a vision, an auditory hallucination, or if it was just a kid who tells Augustine to go read the Bible. like I said, it's unclear. One of the lines in one of them is a voice of a child told him to go read the Bible. So again, I don't know if this is just an auditory hallucination that he had, right? Or an angel whispered in his ear, or if some kid, kicked a soccer ball over to him and said, you should go read the Bible. And I don't know, but that's apparently the story. To which he does what is such a modern thing. Apparently he goes, grabs the book of Paul's epistles, opens it at random and starts reading. He reads a portion of Romans 13 first, which is about life in Christ against life in the world kind of stuff. And it strikes him, and so he reads through all of Romans, and by the time he's done, this is the faith for him. So a little bit of a wild conversion story, but we can see the roots of his conversion going throughout his life, right? So after reading Romans, he adopts the faith the next year, in the year 387. Over the Easter Vigil, both Augustine and his son were baptized by Ambrose. So he baptizes both of them. They both enter into the faith. It's vaguely around this time. It's while he's still in Milan. He's not in Milan for long. It's while Augustine is in Milan that he dismisses his second concubine and breaks off the betrothal. He says, I'm not doing this. He's moving towards priesthood. He's not there yet, but he can kind of see the writing on the wall. And so he breaks off his relationship. He kind of informally prolongs the betrothal. And then he eventually just breaks it off for good. Later that same year, so in 387, Augustine, his son, and his mother would move back to Africa, back to Hippo Regialis. However, his mother did die on the journey. I got no impression that it was anything dramatic. I think she just got sick and died, kind of thing. I didn't see any cause or anything like that. But they weren't like set upon by bandits or anything crazy like that. She just died in a seaport while they were waiting to get a ship to take them back to Carthage. Back to Africa. Right. So his mother died on the journey while still in Italy. Augustine then started living the life basically of an aristocrat on his family property for most of the rest of that year. However, he kind of hits a turning point near the end of the year when his son dies as well. So the big year for Augustine, he's baptized, and then his mother and his son both die with a move across the Mediterranean. So a lot happens really fast for him there. To be fair, he's 32 now, so a lot's happened very quickly in his life.
How old was his son at that point?
I think he was 16. Would that work? Yeah, it makes him 18 when he had him. I know he's got to be at least 17, right? I want to say he was 16. He might have been 15, depending on the years. I don't know when during the year.
Do we know what happened to him?
I don't. Is it known? Probably. Like I said, he wrote an autobiography, but I didn't look into it. Again, I didn't get the sense that it was violent or anything like that. I mean, it's one of these hard truths of the ancient world that people, especially young people, and he's past the age that it's like super common for kids to die, but people just die. It's during the Roman Republic. There's a consular, young guy. Consular is like the emperor before the emperor, kind of like the president, but there's two of them. Anyway. He's a young guy. He's really young. He's like in his 20s. Right, so president of the United States in his 20s falls off a horse and just dies. He broke a leg, it got infected, and he died. Nothing you can do about it, right? If it gets infected. If you got an infection in the ancient world, you either died or you didn't. I mean, until penicillin and antibiotics, like 150 years ago, if you got an infection, you either died or you didn't. There are no two ways about it. Which I've thought about. Well, like doing yard work and getting a cut with a lot of dirt in it, because I'm not worried about that, because I got Neosporin in the house if it gets to be problematic, right? But, 500 years ago, getting a cut that got a lot of dirt in it, I might die. Or, I might lose an arm. You cut it off before the infection spreads, kind of thing. But that's a nasty business too. Yeah, the ancient world, not a fun place to be, right?
Penicillin changed the law.
Oh my goodness!
It's
Yeah.
not mandatory. The patient say, well, you're either going to die or not.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy how true that was. Man, I'm listening to this podcast about weird things in history, and they were talking about the doctors and the surgeons in London, like 20 years before penicillin. And like this one surgeon was super popular. He was famous, right? People would come to watch him work. His record was a full leg amputation with sutures in 30 seconds.
Whoa.
Right? In fact, we're really off topic. There is a story that's too good not to talk about that is possibly true, possibly not, that he holds the record for the worst fatality rate in a surgery, where he performed surgery on one person and 3 people died. Because he was moving so quick. The guy he amputated died. He cut someone with a knife, they bled out, and then another person got an infection from the surgery as well. So in one surgery, he killed 3 people. It might not be true, but it gives you a sense of what medicine used to be like, right? And there is a massive, somewhat politically charged soapbox about this that I'm not going to jump off of. But basically, medicine's a good thing, right? Because you don't just die. It's crazy. Right? Anyway, neither here nor there. So, Augustine's son dies, and at this, on the occasion of the death of his son, Augustine sells all of his family's holdings, with the exception of the family house, to give to the poor, right? He turns his family home into a proto-monastery, which will come back up later. But he turns his home basically into a monastery, and he takes up the priesthood soon thereafter. Augustine officially becomes a priest in the year 391. So again, like I said, just a few years after this. And he quickly goes about setting his rhetorical skills to work for the church. Estimates are that Augustine preached between 6,000 and 10,000 unique sermons during his lifetime as a priest. Of those, we have between 350 and 500 of them still existing. Most of them would have taken over an hour to preach. And we have a lot of them still existing because stenographers followed him around and wrote his sermons down. By the way, the reason there's a range, 350 to 500, is because we have 500 or more that say Augustine on them, but there's a chunk of them that we're thinking that wasn't Augustine. So that was someone else. We talked about this in a previous class. Someone else put their name on it, right? Pseudo-Augustine is what we would call them officially. So chances are, right, let's go with the lowball number and lowball it a little bit more. We have at least 200 of his sermons that you can still go read today. Everything Augustine wrote that we still have has been translated multiple times. So yeah, you can go read some Augustine stuff if you'd like. So he preached a lot, right? He was a rhetorician. That's what he was very talented in, and he put that to work. He sought to teach the faith, fight against the Manichaean teachings that were still around, and use his talents to, quote, ensure the salvation of his audience. That to him was the goal. Those are the goals of his sermons. And so that's what he worked towards in his preaching. We'll notice that Augustine is very interested in his church members, in the people under his care. More so than someone like Cyril, who's more of a big picture guy. Augustine puts almost all of his effort into his local congregation. I mean, it's a whole city and the surrounding area, but he cares enormously for the people. as much as Augustine is this massive figure, he didn't have a massive mindset, if you will. He was, I'm a local bishop. I am here for my people to teach them, to give them the ability. Manichaeism was big in North Africa, right? So I'm going to teach them how to avoid and argue against Manichaeism. I want to make sure that they understand how the Bible is about their salvation so that they can be saved. He was elevated to Bishop of Hippo in 395 and served in that role until his death in the year 430. While he was bishop, he established a regular reading schedule, a lectionary, basically. I would be surprised if he was the first one to develop a lectionary, but he develops his own. I don't know if you know anything about that, Joe.
There were lectures before that, but he probably standardized it.
Yeah, he definitely standardizes it. And right, so you know what the guy's going to preach on the next Sunday, right? That kind of thing. And his goal in preaching is that he would explain and teach the text to his listeners and how it was about and for them. Which, if that sounds a lot like the Lutheran motto for teaching, there's a reason for that. Augustine, if you don't know, is extremely influential on the Lutheran Church. We'll get to that in his legacy. In the year 430, the Vandals besieged Hippo. The Vandals, by the way, were a barbarian group out of what is today Spain. That's where they kind of started their thing. And they're one of the barbarian tribes that rampages around Rome in the 5th century. The word vandalism comes from these guys, right? So vandalism is called vandalism because the Vandals broke so much Roman stuff that they named it after them, right? So the Vandals besiege Hippo in the year 430. At the same time, Augustine enters into what would be his final illness. When he kind of gets into his deathbed, basically, as an act of penance, this is going to sound weird to us, he excommunicates himself and requested that the penitential psalms be hung on the walls in his room so that he could at all times weep for his sins and pray for forgiveness, as he would say. He also does it as an act of solidarity to common people, who I think he saw as being concerned about their sins, right? Thus, in penance and repentance, Augustine died on August 28th of 430. After his death, the Vandals briefly lifted the siege, as far as I can tell, totally unrelated to the death of St. Augustine, before they do end up returning, at which time they burned the city to the ground with the exception of Augustine's cathedral and the library that he established. The rest of the city's gone, but those two places stayed. And so there we have the death of Augustine. Not by violence, even though his city was under siege when it happened. That's when he happened to have his second birthday, right? His heavenly birthday. Questions on the life of St. Augustine before we kind of dive into his works and his legacy. All right. As is true with a lot of these guys, we can't even begin to touch on the works of St. Augustine because of how much there is and how significant it is. Basically, if you put every area of theology on a dartboard and threw a dart at it, Augustine had something very influential and long-term impactful to say about it. Now, he is a Western theologian with Western ideas, specifically about the Filioque, he has some views on Mary that the Eastern Church does not like, yet they still venerate him as a saint and a theologian. That's just as an idea of how impactful Augustine was in his teaching, even to the church at large. So, 3 works that are most relevant for us. The first is one of his more famous ones. I know some people are required to read it in lit classes in high school, is The City of God. Have any of you ever heard of this? All right. I've not read it. It's gigantic, and I've heard it's not easy. But it was written in the year 410 after the Visigoths sacked Rome. The Visigoths are another one of these barbarian tribes rampaging around the Roman Empire in this time, and they're the first ones to sack Rome. This is the first time in, 700 years that an enemy has been inside of Rome. Rome burns basically to the ground. It's sacked. It's mostly destroyed. And again, like we said, political power has shifted out of Rome at this point in time, but symbolic meaning has not. And so the sacking of Rome creates, every sacking of Rome, especially the first one, creates a massive crisis for the Roman citizens. People are convinced the world is over, that Jesus is around the corner, or that Jesus has even been defeated because the eternal city is doomed, right? Basically, all of the Roman Empire was having a panic attack because Rome got sacked. They were incapable of dealing with it. And into that milieu, Augustine writes the City of God. He attempts to kind of calm everyone down. And more or less one of the overarching themes of the City of God is that God's city is not Rome. God's city is not on earth. God's kingdom is a heavenly kingdom. No, Jesus has not been defeated, even if the world looks like it's burning all around you. It will be okay, is the vague scope of what he's getting at. You have anything to add to that, Joseph? I'm sure you're more educated on this book than I am.
Well, he pulls in a lot of his theology into there, as well as it's a place where you get some of his biblical exegesis, especially the Old Testament.
Right, trying to deal with what's going on. He used the Bible to do it, yeah.
Yep.
So that's City of God. The second is one of his major doctrinal works, theological works. It's on Christian doctrine. It's his dogmatic textbook, basically. And then the last one that's a major work is his Confessions. I've mentioned it already. It's his autobiographical account of his life, where he examines, among an enormous amount of other things, it's again a giant book, none of these are small, he examines sin, penance, repentance, all these kinds of things. This is where he starts to develop some ideas about a word you might know, concupiscence. Like, what is original sin? How does it interact with us? Where's guilt lie in all of these sorts of things? He's really taking a good hard look at sin and trying to kind of work out what's going on. Which I should hope by now you can understand why that might be something, because he lived the life, right? He was, by all accounts, outside, living contrary to God's will in just about every aspect for a long time, even after his conversion. And so he was trying to sort all of that out, right? His legacy is hard to overstate, and you hear that comment a lot. It's not really possible to oversell how important Augustine is and his theological impact. The one we're going to go over today, because we're who we are, is that Augustine had a massive impact on the Lutheran Church and the Lutheran reformers. Anyone know why? Why is Augustine, of all the church fathers, East and West, why is Augustine the one that gets prime place? It has to do with Luther and his biography. When Luther joined the monastery, he joined the Augustinian order. So he joins the order that's dedicated to Augustine and founded by him, kind of, sort of, maybe, I don't know, that kind of thing. This shrouded a lot of stuff, but focused on Augustinian teachings. So it comes as no surprise that Luther was deeply steeped in Augustinian theology. And you see a lot of reflections of Augustinian theology in Lutheran teachings, right? I've already mentioned that his view on preaching is very similar to ours. His view on original sin, confession, grace, the person of God, all are deeply reflective of Lutheran confessional teaching. As an example of this, when I was at seminary, I did a project to help someone else do research where I analyzed the quotes and references, citations from the church fathers in Article 4 of the Augsburg Confession, which, if you remember, that's the one on which the church rises or falls. It's the justification article. It's like the central point. The apology, the longer one, is the AC4, and not the apology is not that long. And I made a pie chart, and I did all this other statistical analysis of it, that kind of stuff. Not statistical analysis that would impress any of you guys that actually do that kind of stuff. I just like put stuff into Microsoft Word pie charts, right? They quoted from, in just this one article, the church, or Chemnitz and not Chemnitz, Melanchthon and these guys quote from a wide range, something like 30 different church fathers, going all the way back. I think Justin Martyr's the earliest one that they directly quote in that article, going way forward. I even put some of the scholastic theologians in there. I don't remember the exact number, but it was something like 60% of the quotes were from Augustine. And that kind of runs true of the rest of the confessions, where the Lutheran confessors are quoting from the early church a lot, right? Because one of the points that the Lutheran reformers are trying to make is we're not new, right? We're bringing back the original teaching, right? We're undoing the corruption. We're not the first ones to think of these things. And so they very heavily, whenever they could, quote and reference the church fathers and say, look, these guys agree with us. You recognize them. You should agree with us, kind of thing. Augustine's overwhelmingly the church father that is quoted. And a lot of it has to do with Luther's Augustinian background and kind of just the way the theology and the way it was written kind of worked itself out. So Augustine is hugely influential in the Lutheran church. If you're going to grab one church father that is like the patron saint of Lutheranism, even though we don't do that, Augustine's the one that you would probably grab. I can't think of anyone else. Can you?
No, he's the biggie.
He's the biggie, right?
Jerome was a big one, but he had his problems.
I was going to say, we also got a little annoyed at Jerome and the Vulgate. And less Jerome and more what had happened to the thing the work that he did. But, yeah. And that isn't to say that Lutherans agree with everything Augustine said. We don't. We're the Lutheran church, not the Augustine church, right? Not that we agree with everything Luther said either, but we have disagreements with Augustine as well. Kind of some of the nitty-gritty of his view on concupiscence we're a little hesitant on. I think that's the big one that we're...
The big question is concupiscence sin?
Right.
Or not? In Catholicism went the other direction. Lutherans insist that, yes, it is.
Concupiscence, by the way, is like that drive and desire for sinfulness that rests in you. It's like the sinful flesh thing, kind of. Concupiscence is also one of those really slippery terms that everyone defines a little bit different, so it's hard to really nail down. Another one of these quotes from Augustine that you've probably heard, and I don't remember the exact quote. I don't know why I didn't write it down. But Augustine writes about how God created man, and man, therefore, has a God-shaped hole that only he can fill. Without God, humanity is missing something, right? And so, I mean, I know you've heard that or a version of that many times, right? There's a cross-shaped hole in your heart. Only Jesus can fill it, that kind of thing. That thought comes from Augustine. I feel like there's another one that's a biggie. He writes a defense of the 7-day creation, which I think is interesting because he goes the opposite direction. Because most people in his day said that creation was probably instantaneous because God can do everything instantaneously. And he says, no, God took 7 whole days to do it, right? So it's kind of the opposite of the argument we're having nowadays. But because of that kind of weird facet of history, we do have a church father that wrote about arguments for the 7-day creation, which if you know some of the drama around this, the Lutherans never talk about it because it wasn't an issue. No one had any disagreements, and so that's caused some consternation over the years when it does come up. But that's neither here nor there. But we got Augustine talking about it, so that's pretty neat. Yeah, I think that's what I got. Anything else? Any questions about Augustine or anything going forward?
I just mentioned
Yeah.
some of his major stuff is major reading. If you want something more accessible, try a little tractate called On Faith, Hope, and Love.
On Faith, Hope, and Love. Yeah, I think I was assigned that. I don't think I read it.
It's much more accessible.
Right. Yeah. And again, Augustine is for the people, right? He cares about his flock. That's what he is driven by. So, yeah. Next week, we will close out the era of the Church Fathers. We're going to jump fairly far forward in history for all sorts of reasons, but we're going to jump to the end, talking about an individual, John of Damascus. If you were in the seniors Bible study last year when we were talking about the Muslim conquest, this guy came up as a reference. But really interesting guy. He's considered by many as the last of the Church Fathers and the first of the Scholastics, which, by the way, that's kind of the next era of church theology, historical theology, is scholasticism. This is where you get Lombard sentences and things like that. Humanism's on the tail end. Thomas Aquinas is the big guy for this. That's the scholastic era of the church. And then after that, which one follows the scholastic era? The Reformation era of the church, right? Luther mucks up the whole scholastic thing. Actually, yeah, no, Luther really is kind of like one of three guys that throws a ton of wrenches into that works. And then we have the Reformation era of the church. So we're going to kind of capstone the Church Fathers with John of Damascus. And then you'll come back the week after that, and I'll remind you all that you're sinners who are going to die, otherwise known as Ash Wednesday. And we will begin Lent. My current plan, which I retain the right to change, is that after Easter, we will do a study of the book of Jonah. Part of the reason I would like to do a study of the book of Jonah is because I went through and did it with the youth in the fall, and if I don't have to work twice, I'm not going to. Although I need to change it. With the youth, it was much more touchy-feely. Sorry, Steve, we're not getting into your feelings very much. But so the plan is to go through the book of Jonah after Easter, but that's forever away, and it'll come very soon. So thank you, everyone. If there are no more questions, we'll close with the Lord's Prayer. Oh.
I don't have a question, but
Okay.
did you read about the young person that was swallowed by the whale and then spit back out?
I did not read about it. I saw the video of it. Yeah, the dad's filming his son getting eaten by a whale. It's crazy. It was not an intentional consumption. It was just doing it, that filter feeding thing. And
I don't want this.
well, yeah, they eat krill, not kayaks. But you know what? Thanks, Annabeth. I got me way off topic here. Blue whales are crazy, which I know this wasn't a blue whale. They're crazy, right? Like, I don't know if you know how big a blue whale is, but you don't know how big a blue whale is. Blue whales are the largest animal to ever exist. It does not matter what dinosaur you want to grab. Blue whale is bigger than it. Annabeth, you could swim in their blood veins, their blood vessels. That's how, they're huge. It's ridiculous. Anyway, I got like an informational video about a blue whale like a month ago, and like my brain exploded because I can't even comprehend a creature that big. It's ridiculous. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about.
We were just at the aquarium Monday, and they said that the whale sharks have their esophagus is the size of a quarter.
That's crazy.
Really? Wow.
They can only eat little stuff.
Yeah. The ocean's weird, man. There's also a picture of an anglerfish that's gone pretty viral, right? You see this one? It's this big, scary, it's an anglerfish swam to the surface. It's this big, scary picture. And then like 2 weeks later, a picture of the guy taking the picture came out. The thing's this big, which then sent me down a rabbit hole on anglerfish. And some of them can be 6 feet long. Other ones are this big. And the real crazy thing is they exhibit extreme sexual dimorphism. So the 6 foot one and the 3-inch one could be the same species. The big one's the female. The oceans are wild, man. It is a crazy place out there. Holy cow. Wow. Okay. Any other really off-topic things you guys want to talk about? You know I'm here for. I know I got 10 more minutes to talk about whatever I want, right?
Yeah.
Man, we got amputations, anglerfish. Antibiotics. We were all over the place today. On Sunday, I was talking with the youth, and at one point, because we joke that the class has diagnosable ADHD. We are all over the place in youth. But at one point I stopped and I said, how did we start talking about this? We were talking about like steroid use in bodybuilding and stuff like that. And it started, I don't even remember, but it started with like Joseph forgiving his brothers. And then we ended up on steroids. We figured it out, but man, that was, you think, I bet here you should see the high schoolers. Because they're all even worse than me about getting off on tangents. And I run off on every one of them with it. Anyway. Let's say the Lord's Prayer. How's that sound? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right, I will see you all.